The phone rang at 1:48 a.m. My son was sobbing, screaming that his wife was dying on an ER bed and that the hospital would let her die if I didn't transfer $30,000 immediately. I jumped out of bed. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. But in that very moment, through his choking sobs, I heard a whisper behind him. Not weak, not panicked, cold and clear. "Say it. He'll believe you." I stood frozen in the dark. In 30 years of being a father, I had never heard a voice that made me understand so quickly. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a performance. I replied with a single sentence, the one sentence I had never dared to say in my entire life, and hung up. And I had no idea that just a few hours later, the police would call back to tell me that the call had only been the first step in something far bigger. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. My name is Robert Hale, 69 years old, a widower. I live alone in a 2-story wooden house in the northern suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, where winters drag on and evenings are so quiet you can hear the wall clock breathing with you. I worked as a civil engineer for more than 40 years, designing roads and bridges for state projects. My whole life I've been used to numbers, to load limits, to pressure, the invisible kind that can bend steel if you miscalculate by even 1%. That night, I was sleeping on my usual half of the bed, the other half still empty since my wife passed away. I keep it that way out of habit, even though I know no one is coming back to lie beside me. The ringing phone jolted the room awake. 1:48 a.m. I glanced at the clock before reaching for the phone, an old professional reflex. Check the data before reacting. At my age, a call at that hour only means 2 things. Someone is about to die, or someone already has. Dad. Dad. Evan's voice shattered in my ear. My son. My only child. His voice was trembling, hoarse, frantic, like he was running in the rain. "You have to help me, please. Lydia. Lydia is in the ER. Her heart. The doctors say it's her heart. They need money right now, $30,000. If there's no money, they won't do anything." I sprang up, my bare feet hitting the ice-cold wooden floor. Panic rushed in fast and familiar, exactly like every time Evan had called me with another crisis over the past 10 years. A credit card debt, a car accident, a temporary setback at work. I was always the safety brake, the load-bearing wall behind him. "Which hospital are you at?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady even as my heart slammed in my chest. "Dad, there's no time," Evan shouted. "They're getting ready. I don't know. I've never seen Lydia like this. Please, Dad, just send the money. I'll pay you back. I swear." I had left the bedroom and was walking down the dark hallway, the kitchen light casting a faint glow ahead. In my mind, I saw Lydia lying pale and weak on a hospital bed, tubes everywhere. Even though my daughter-in-law and I had never truly gotten along, I wasn't the kind of man who could abandon someone who was dying. I almost agreed. I almost turned back into my office to power up the computer. I almost let fear push me into doing the one thing I had done my whole life, sign another invisible check with blind trust. Then I heard that voice. Not loud, not trembling, not the voice of someone who was dying. "Say it. He'll believe you." It came fast, like a line from a script already rehearsed. Lydia. I knew it instantly. I had heard that tone at enough dinners and family gatherings to recognize it, always soft enough to sound polite, always cold enough that no one dared push back. I stopped in the middle of the kitchen. The fluorescent light hummed softly overhead. The dining table was empty, except for the chair where my wife used to sit. I tightened my grip on the phone. In that moment, it wasn't panic that flooded in. It was memory. The times Lydia rolled her eyes when I told old stories, the half-smiles when she joked about my outdated house, The look in her eyes at my wife's funeral. Not grief, not pain, but as if she were measuring something. And the time she slid a stack of papers toward me, smiling brightly, saying it was just family paperwork, urging me to sign quickly because the lawyer was waiting. I had ignored all of it, for Evan, because I was the father, because I believed silence was how you kept a family from falling apart. "Dad?" Evan said, his voice more urgent now. "Are you still there? They're counting down." I took a deep breath, the way I used to before walking into meetings with the most demanding investors. Stay calm, assess the load, find the weak point. "Evan," I said, my voice sounding unfamiliar to my own ears, lower and slower than usual. "Call Lydia's parents." There was a very brief pause, so brief most people wouldn't notice it. But I was used to pauses like that. The pause bridges make just before they crack. "Dad, what are you saying?" Evan stammered. They're not answering, and besides, this is our family." "Family," I repeated, bitterness spreading in my mouth. "Then all the more reason to call them." Evan's voice shot up. "Don't do this to me right now. Lydia could die." And then I heard Lydia again. This time, she didn't even bother to whisper. "Give me the phone." I didn't hear Evan protest, just a rustle, then silence, a short breath. I hung up. Not in anger, not in panic. I hung up like a man who had finally placed the right brick after a lifetime of building on the wrong foundation. The phone screen went dark. The kitchen was dead quiet. I stood there, still gripping the phone, my heartbeat slowing. I waited for the familiar guilt to crash over me. Waited for fear. Waited for the voice in my head telling me I had just done the worst thing of my life. But nothing came. Just a strange sense of relief, like the first time in years I could take a full breath without something pressing on my chest. I made coffee. The clock read 2:10 a.m. I sat at the table and looked out the window. Snow drifted lightly under the streetlights. I thought about my wife, about how she used to say there were bridges you shouldn't keep fixing. You had to tear them down before they collapsed on someone else. The phone didn't ring again. No messages, no threats. That unsettled me even more. People who are truly desperate don't go silent like that. I didn't go back to bed. I sat there until the sky began to turn gray. The coffee grew cold. Unnamed questions lined up in my head, but one thought kept repeating, clearer than all the rest. That call wasn't the end. It was a test. And if I was right, then the next move would come quickly. I had no idea that just a few hours later, as the sun was lifting above the bare trees in my front yard, the phone would ring again. This time, it wasn't Evan's number, not Lydia's. It was a man's voice, unfamiliar, introducing himself as a police officer, saying he needed to speak with me about an emergency call placed at 2:15 a.m. From my son's address. That's when I knew my instincts had been right. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be simple again. The phone rang again, just as the sky began to brighten. Weak sunlight slipped through the kitchen curtains, lighting up the table where my coffee had long gone cold. I looked at the number on the screen, a string of digits I didn't recognize, not Evans, not anyone I knew. I hesitated for the briefest moment, then answered, "Mr. Robert Hale?" A man's voice, calm and steady, with the cadence of someone used to speaking in uncomfortable situations. "This is Officer Mark Collins with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. I'm sorry to call so early, but we need to confirm a few things." I straightened, my back against the cold sink. "Yes. What's going on, officer?" "Are you aware of a 911 call made at approximately 2:15 a.m. this morning?" he asked. I closed my eyes for a moment. The feeling I'd been pushing aside all morning, the floating, uneasy feeling, collapsed into a heavy point in my chest. I I received a call from my son around that time, I said slowly. But it wasn't 911. Your son's name is Evan Hale, correct? Yes. And he lives at the address on Maple Grove? I confirmed it. The line went quiet for a few seconds, long enough for me to hear the faint rustle of papers, the scratch of a pen. Small sounds, but in the stillness of the early morning kitchen, they were sharp. We received an emergency call reporting a woman experiencing severe cardiac complications at that address, Officer Collins continued. The caller requested an ambulance and provided health insurance information under your name. I opened my eyes. The morning light suddenly felt too bright. My insurance information? Yes, sir. Your full name, date of birth, and policy number were all read accurately. My hands went cold. That wasn't information just anyone had, and certainly not something someone would recite flawlessly in a panicked call. The ambulance arrived at the address within 12 minutes, he went on, but no one answered the door. EMTs knocked, rang the bell, and called the number back. There was no response. I leaned against the sink. In my mind, I saw Evan standing in a dark living room, phone pressed to his ear, eyes on Lydia. The image was vivid, though I had never seen it. What happened then? I asked. After 20 minutes per protocol, they had to leave, Officer Collins said. There were no visible signs of an emergency, no sounds, no one appeared. I swallowed. Evan's wife, Lydia. She wasn't admitted to any hospital? No, sir. His voice dropped slightly. We checked every hospital in the area, within a radius of more than 50 miles. There is no intake record matching the description from the call. A silence settled between us. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that comes when the truth is already clear and no one needs to say more. I looked out the window. The snow had stopped, leaving a thin white layer on the wooden fence. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. So, the call was fake? I asked, even though I already knew. That's what we believe, Officer Collins said. A false emergency call. The word false hung in the air. It carried no emotion, no anger, no pity, just a cold label for a deliberate act. I thought about Lydia's whisper on the phone, about how calmly she'd spoken, like she was directing a scene. Is there anything else? I asked, feeling like I was standing at the edge of something tall. Yes, he said, and this is where we'll need your cooperation. I turned away from the window, facing the empty dining table. I'm listening. Immediately after the 911 call ended, there were 3 attempts to log into your health insurance portal, Officer Collins said. All 3 failed due to incorrect passwords, but the system logged the IP address. A chill ran straight down my spine. That IP address matches your son's residence. I closed my eyes again, this time longer. The night replayed in my mind piece by piece, no longer scattered. The 148 call, the pressure, the demand for money, the 911 call at 2:15, then the attempts to access my insurance. Everything in an order too neat to be coincidence. Mr. Hale, Officer Collins said, his tone softening. We're not drawing conclusions yet, but the timelines align in a concerning way. I understand, I said, and this time I truly did. Not with the logic of a man who had read hundreds of technical reports, but with the instinct of someone who had lived long enough to know when he was being targeted. We need to ask, he continued, have you authorized anyone to use your insurance information? Your son or your daughter-in-law? No, I answered immediately. Never. Have you signed any authorization forms related to insurance or medical care recently? An image flashed through my mind. Lydia at the dining table, sliding a thin stack of papers toward me, smiling, saying it was just an information update. I had signed a few pages, then stopped when one clause felt wrong. I'd said I wanted a lawyer to review the rest. She hadn't liked that. "I didn't complete anything," I said carefully, "and nothing that grants access to my insurance." "Thank you," Officer Collins said. "That's important." I took a deep breath. "Officer Collins, do you think this was impulsive? Or—" He didn't answer right away. I heard a chair shift as if he'd changed position. "I've been doing this job for 14 years, he said finally. "And I can tell you this, impulsive cases are messy. This one isn't." That settled it. No one builds a chain of actions like that out of panic. No one tries to log into insurance 3 times in the same window unless they know exactly what they're looking for. "What should I do?" I asked. "For now, we recommend changing all passwords related to your finances and insurance," Officer Collins said. "And if anyone contacts you asking for money or personal information, don't provide it. Call us." "I will," I said. The call ended with brief formalities. I set the phone down on the table and stared at it like it was something unfamiliar. Outside, a car passed by, leaving tracks in the snow. Life went on, unaware that in a single night, the line between family and danger had been erased. I sat down. The kitchen suddenly felt too large. I thought about Evan, about the way he'd cried on the phone, and wondered how much of it had been real. I thought about Lydia, about the calm in her voice during the so-called emergency. And then, without knowing why, I thought about my old profession. Bridges don't collapse the moment a crack appears. They endure. They carry load after load, day after day, until one force hits the exact weak point. Last night, I had seen the crack. This morning's call told me someone was testing how much more weight it could take. I stood up and washed the cup of coffee that had gone cold. Hot water ran over my hands, pulling me back into the present. There was one thing I knew for certain now, clearer than any calculation I had ever done in my life. I had almost become a victim, and what had just happened was not a mistake. It was a test, and if that was the first test, there would be others. After hanging up with the police, I didn't go anywhere. I stayed seated at the kitchen table, staring into the empty space in front of me, where the morning light slanted through the window and laid pale streaks across the wooden surface. The house was so quiet, I could clearly hear the ticking second hand of the wall clock, the clock my wife had chosen simply because she liked its steady rhythm, saying it made her feel like everything was still moving in time. I thought I would feel angry or afraid, but the first thing that came instead was memory. It didn't crash over me like a wave. It came quietly, in small fragments, like old photographs being pulled out after years buried deep in a drawer. I didn't summon them. They arrived on their own, as if they had only been waiting for me to stop denying them. I remembered the first time Lydia stepped into this house. It was an autumn afternoon, the maple tree in the front yard just starting to turn a deep orange. Evan brought her home to meet us, his hand resting lightly on her back as if he were presenting something fragile and precious. Lydia stood in the doorway, taking a quick look around, her eyes sweeping across the living room, the staircase, the framed photos on the wall. She smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. "This house, it's cozy," she said, her tone polite enough. Then she added lightly, almost like a passing breeze, "Very classic." I laughed. I always laughed in moments like that. This house was built in the late 1970s when my wife and I were young, when everything was still ahead of us. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. I had personally inspected every beam, every step. To me, it was safe. To Lydia, it seemed to be just something outdated. In the years that followed, comments like that kept coming, always wrapped in harmless packaging. "I don't know how you stand winters here." "I'd be so bored living in a place like this." "Oh, these things. You probably keep them just for sentimental reasons, right?" I heard them, and I let them pass. Lydia was very good at asking questions that seemed casual. At first, they were general. Whether I was still working, when I planned to retire, how expensive it must be to maintain a house like this. Then, gradually, they became more specific. Where I kept my savings, what insurance I had, whether I had made a will. "It's just so we know and can be prepared," she said, looking straight at me, her voice sincere. "You know, we worry about you." I wanted to believe that. I did believe it. I was a man who had spent his life inside orderly systems. If someone asked the right way, I answered. I never imagined someone would patiently plant small questions over years just to build a trap. There were evenings when Evan called me, his voice heavy. Work wasn't going well. Expenses were up. A new debt had appeared. I can't remember how many times it happened. I only remember the familiar feeling every time the phone rang, the feeling of knowing I was about to fix something that shouldn't have been mine to fix. "Just this once, Dad," Evan would say. "I promise." I helped, not because I was wealthy, but because I didn't want my son to fall apart. I paid off the credit card debt Evan said was temporary. I helped repair the car Lydia drove, the one she said she needed for work. I transferred money so they could get through a rough patch. Every time Lydia thanked me, but her thanks always felt procedural, polite enough that no one could fault it, but completely lacking warmth. There was never a, "we'll find a way to pay you back." Never a long explanation, as if my stepping in was simply expected. Evan, my son, rarely looked directly at me during those moments. He kept his head down or looked away. When I asked if they were sure they didn't need anything else, he answered quickly, like he wanted the conversation to end as soon as possible. I used to think that was shame. Now I'm not so sure. There is one memory I tried to bury very deep, but that morning it came back with such clarity I could almost smell the hospital. The day my wife died. The room was stark white, the fluorescent lights cold. I sat by her bed, holding her hand, feeling each breath grow weaker. She no longer had the strength to speak much, but her eyes were still bright, still sharp in a way that made me both comforted and broken. The door opened. Lydia walked in. No flowers, no tears. She stood at the foot of the bed, her arms folded, with the posture of someone who had come to take care of business. "I know this isn't the time," she said, her voice low but clear. "But maybe we should talk about the house. Evan and I think it would be wise to prepare early." I don't remember how I responded. I may not have said anything at all. I only remember my wife's eyes in that moment, not looking at Lydia, but at me. A very brief look, but deep, as if she wanted to say something she no longer had the strength to say. After the funeral, in this same house, when everyone had gone home, I heard Lydia talking to Evan in the living room. She didn't know I was standing in the hallway. "Your mother was always so dramatic," she said lightly. "Even dying, she had to make it all about her." Evan said nothing. That silence hurt me more than Lydia's words ever could, but I didn't step out. I didn't say anything. I turned away, telling myself people say stupid things when they're under stress. That family means putting up with each other, that if I made a scene, I might lose my son. I chose endurance, again and again. Now, sitting alone in the quiet kitchen, I could see each piece falling into place on its own. The questions about paperwork, the temporary money, the evaluating looks at my house, the coldness toward my wife's death. Evan's long, practiced silence. No single piece by itself was enough to condemn anyone, but together they formed a picture I could no longer pretend not to see. I had thought I was holding the family together by enduring. In reality, I had been teaching them that my boundaries didn't exist. I stood and slowly walked through the house. My hand brushed the stair railing, the window where my wife used to place small potted plants. I realized something I should have understood long ago. Some bridges don't collapse because of heavy loads or strong winds, but because people keep ignoring small cracks until there's nothing left to save. Last night's call at 1:48 a.m. was simply the first crack loud enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. And as the memories settled into place, I knew one thing for certain. If I didn't stop now, if I kept enduring just to preserve something called family in name only, then next time the price wouldn't just be money. It would be the rest of my life. That afternoon, I drove to the bank branch where I had done business for more than 30 years. The Ohio sky was gray and low, the kind that makes everything feel heavier than usual. I parked in my usual spot near the entrance, turned off the engine, but didn't get out right away. I sat there for a few seconds, my hands still on the steering wheel, as if I were about to step into an unfamiliar place rather than a red brick building I had visited hundreds of times. Officer Collins was waiting for me at the door. He nodded in greeting, didn't offer a handshake, just gestured for me to follow. The way he kept a careful distance told me that, from this moment on, everything had to be viewed through evidence, not emotion. Inside, the bank was cool, the familiar scent of air conditioning mixed with paper and printer ink. The teller counters were quieter than usual. A few elderly customers sat scattered around, speaking softly. It struck me that none of them knew how easily a forged signature, one wrong click, could drain a lifetime of savings without them ever realizing it. We were led into a small office in the back. A middle-aged woman stood when I entered. I recognized her, Linda, the branch manager. She had congratulated me when I retired, had sent a condolence card when my wife passed. Her eyes today were different. Not the usual familiarity, but caution mixed with concern. "Mr. Robert," she said softly, pulling out a chair for me. "Thank you for coming in." I sat down, placing both hands on the desk. Officer Collins stood slightly behind me, but I knew he was watching every reaction. Linda opened her computer and typed a few lines. She turned the screen toward me. "We reviewed your accounts at the request of the police," she said, "and there are some irregularities." She pressed a key. A pending transfer order appeared on the screen. The number made me pause. $45,000. Status, pending authorization. "I never made this transfer," I said immediately, even though no one had asked. "We know," Linda replied. "It was initiated last night but not completed due to missing final confirmation." Last night. The timing was crystal clear in my mind. Just before 2 a.m. The same time Evan called. The same time the fake 911 call was made. My throat went dry. "There's more," Linda continued, her voice slower now, as if choosing each word carefully. She switched to another screen. 4 months ago, a line of credit was opened. "In your name." I leaned forward. "What?" "A $60,000 line," she said. "There have been several small charges, spread out just enough not to draw attention." I stared at the screen. 60,000. I had never needed a line like that. I had always avoided debt after watching colleagues lose their homes over a few bad financial decisions. "The signature here," Linda said, enlarging a scanned document, "is yours." I looked at the familiar but unfamiliar ink. My name was written correctly, the slant similar to mine. But something was off. One tiny detail, the way the H connected to the A. I saw it instantly, the way a craftsman spots a bad weld at a glance. "That's not mine," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. Linda nodded. "We thought so too." She clicked again. "Statements for this line of credit were not sent to your home address." My heart beat faster. Where were they sent? "A rented mailbox on the south side of the city," she answered. We checked. That box was opened under the name Lydia Hale. Her name landed in the small room like metal striking metal. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Not from shock, but from a clear, unmistakable feeling. Everything I had suspected was being confirmed, piece by piece, without mercy. "And it's not just the mailbox," Linda continued, looking at me with an expression that mixed apology and resolve. "In the records, Lydia Hale is listed as an authorized user of this line of credit." I let out a short breath, not quite a laugh. Authorized user. The phrase echoed in my head, hollow and cold. "I never authorized her," I said. "We understand," Linda replied, "but on paper, there is an authorization form, with a signature matching yours." I opened my eyes and looked straight at her. "How long have you known me, Linda?" She hesitated. "More than 30 years. Have you ever seen me let anyone else touch my accounts?" She shook her head slowly. "Never." The room went quiet. Officer Collins stepped forward. "Mr. Hale," he said, "what we're seeing fits a type of crime known as financial abuse of the elderly." I frowned. I had heard the term on the news. In short segments I usually skimmed past, never thinking it had anything to do with me. I always assumed it happened to people who were frail, confused, unable to protect themselves. "I'm not weak," I said reflexively. Collins nodded. "Exactly. And that's why cases like yours often go unnoticed the longest." He continued, his tone calm. "Financial abuse doesn't require the victim to lack capacity. It only requires trust and time." Time. I thought of the years I had ignored small signs, thought of Lydia patiently laying each brick while I focused on something called family harmony. Linda printed several sets of documents and placed them in front of me. "We've frozen the line of credit," she said, "and temporarily blocked all pending transactions. But you need to understand, without timely intervention, that money could already be gone." I flipped through the pages. Numbers, dates, forged signatures. Each line felt like a small cut, not immediately painful, but deep. "How long has this been happening?" I asked quietly. Linda looked at me, then at Officer Collins. "At least 4 months," she said. "Possibly longer." 4 months. I sat up straighter, looking around the room. Everything suddenly made sense. The small amounts I had sent Evan during that time. Lydia's unusual familiarity with my finances. The questions that had seemed harmless. Not everything had been random. "What do I need to do next?" I asked with no hesitation left. Officer Collins answered, "We'll open a formal investigation. But the most important thing right now is that you understand this. This is not your fault." I looked at him. Part of me wanted to argue. I had always taken responsibility for everything in my life. But sitting there, surrounded by cold paperwork, I realized some mistakes weren't about action. They were about allowing others to cross boundaries. "I think I trusted too much," I said. "Trust isn't wrong," Collins replied. "Being exploited isn't something you chose." The meeting ended after more than an hour. When I stepped outside, the sun was higher, but I didn't feel any warmer. I stood on the bank's steps and took a long breath. One thing had changed forever. The way I looked at my relationship with my son and my daughter-in-law. Before I thought I was support. Now I understood. To someone, I had been nothing more than a resource. And for the first time in many years, I stopped asking myself how to keep the peace. I asked myself how to protect myself. Before it was too late, I had just gotten home when my phone vibrated again. Not a long ring, just a short buzz, as if the person on the other end was hesitating too. I set my keys down on the table, hung my coat on the hook, and only then picked up the phone. Oh, an unfamiliar number. These past few days, unfamiliar numbers no longer surprised me. "Robert?" The woman's voice on the other end was slow, slightly hoarse, carrying a tone I hadn't heard in many years. I froze. "Who is this?" "It's me." Margaret Lewis, your old neighbor, on Maple Grove." The name pulled me straight back into the past. Margaret, the woman who lived 2 houses down, widowed early, who grew roses all along her wooden fence. She had brought soup over when my wife was sick, had sat with me at the funeral without saying much, just resting her hand on mine for a long time. Later, when Evan moved away, Margaret sold her house too and relocated to the west side of the city to be closer to her daughter. We had lost touch after that. "Margaret," I said, my throat suddenly tight. "How are you?" "I'm doing all right," she replied. "I'm calling because I wasn't sure if I should, but after what I heard on the news this morning about the fake emergency call, I thought you should know something." I pulled out a chair and sat down. That familiar, heavy feeling settled in my chest again. "Go ahead." Margaret was quiet for a few seconds, as if organizing her memories. Early this morning, I couldn't sleep. Old habits, you know. I'm usually up late." I remembered. Margaret had once told me she slept very little after her husband died. "A little after 2 a.m., she continued. "I was standing at my living room window, looking out at the street. I saw Lydia." Her name sounded sharp and clear in my room. I gripped the phone. "What about Lydia?" "She didn't look like someone who was dying," Margaret said firmly. "She was walking fast, upright, not unsteady at all, wearing a dark coat. She looked completely healthy." I closed my eyes. The image Evan had painted the night before, Lydia gasping on a hospital bed, collapsed instantly. "Are you sure?" I asked, even though I no longer doubted it. "I'm sure," Margaret said. "I watched her long enough to be sure, and I also saw her meet a man." My heart started beating harder. "What man?" "Not Evan," she replied. "I know your son. This man was shorter, broad-shouldered, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. They met at the end of the street, near the streetlight that's been broken since last year." I pictured Maple Grove at night, pale yellow light casting long shadows on the pavement. "What happened then?" "They talked briefly," Margaret said. "No arguing, no urgency, like 2 people who had planned to meet. Then Lydia took something out of her bag. A file." She paused and took a breath. "Not an envelope, a thick stack, stiff paper. I saw her hand it to him." A chill ran down my spine. "Did you see it clearly?" "Clearly enough," Margaret said. "The streetlight was shining right on them. And, Robert, I'm sorry, I know this may sound strange, but I saw your name on the cover." I jumped to my feet. "My name?" "Yes," she said, "in capital letters, very clear. I couldn't read everything, but I saw Robert Hale. I'm certain." A long moment passed without either of us speaking. I could hear Margaret's breathing on the other end. She wasn't calling to cause panic. She was speaking like someone who had thought very carefully before deciding to pick up the phone. "What did they do after that?" I asked. "The man slipped the file into his bag," she said. "Then they separated." Lydia walked quickly back toward the house. The man headed on foot toward the public parking lot. I didn't follow him. I didn't think it was my business. Not until this morning. I leaned back against the wall. Everything was lining up in my mind with frightening precision. The call at 1:48 a.m., Lydia whispering instructions, the fake 911 call, the failed insurance logins, the pending transfer, the line of credit, and now a file with my name on it handed off in the dark. "Thank you," I said quietly. "Thank you for calling me." "I don't know if I really helped," Margaret said, "but I thought you should know. Lydia, she's not a good person." I didn't argue. "You did the right thing," I said. "Truly." After I hung up, I stood still for a long time. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming. Outside, the afternoon was already slipping away. Sunlight angled through the window, leaving long bands of light across the floor. I picked up my phone and called Officer Collins. He answered almost immediately, as if he had expected my call. "I just received some information," I said, recounting Margaret's call without leaving out a single detail. I could hear Collins taking notes, occasionally asking me to confirm times and locations. "Her recollection is quite specific," he said when I finished. "We'll check nearby traffic cameras." "And the man?" I asked. "We already have a lead," Collins replied. "This morning, while reviewing transactions related to your line of credit, we noticed one name appearing repeatedly as an intermediary." I held my breath. "Who?" "A man named Derek Hayes," he said. "He has a record of financial fraud. He's been linked to several similar cases, but he's hard to catch because he always operates behind the scenes." Derek Hayes. The name didn't bring up a face, but I knew the type. People who never get their hands dirty, who stay in the shadows, receive files, sign papers, move money, and disappear. "So that means—" I began. "So this is no longer a family matter," Collins finished for me. "And you need to understand that as soon as possible." I looked around the house. Family photos on the walls, Christmas mornings, smiles that had faded with time. Family. The word suddenly felt distorted, unfamiliar. "I thought," I said slowly, "that this was all just small-scale greed, that Lydia was only exploiting me within the family." "No," Collins said. "What you're describing, document handoffs, secret meetings, an intermediary with a criminal record, that's a structure, planned, networked." Something inside me collapsed completely, not loudly, not violently, just a door closing very slowly, the door of my last bit of innocence. "What do I do now?" I asked. "You don't do anything," Collins replied. "You observe, and you keep yourself safe. We'll handle the rest." The call ended. I set the phone down on the table. Outside, darkness began to creep over the garden. I stepped out onto the back porch and stood there, looking at the bare trees, the light wind making dry branches tap softly against each other. I thought of Margaret, standing at her window in the night, seeing what I had refused to see for years. I thought of Lydia, walking steadily under the streetlight, handing over a file with my name on it as if it were merchandise. And I thought of the unknown man, someone who didn't know me at all, yet treated my life like a transaction. That was when I understood something with absolute clarity, with no room left to retreat. This had never been just between me, Evan, and Lydia. I had been pulled into something larger, colder, where family was merely a tool and people were just numbers. And from that moment on, I knew I could no longer look at everything through the eyes of a father. I had to see it through the eyes of someone being hunted, and slowly learning how to stand upright again. That afternoon passed with a strange slowness. After the call with the police, I didn't turn on any lights in the house. I sat in the old armchair by the window, where my wife used to sit and read every evening, watching the daylight fade in the yard. I didn't try to think about anything, but memories kept finding their way back, quietly and persistently, like cold seeping through a thin coat. Just before 6 p.m., the doorbell rang. Not hurried, not urgent, 3 light knocks, spaced out, very familiar. I stood up, walked to the door, and the moment I saw who was standing on the porch, my heart seemed to stall. It was Nora Whitman. Nora was my wife's closest friend. They had known each other since college, studied nursing together, struggled through the early years of marriage, watched their children grow up and then leave. Nora was short, her gray hair neatly cut, her eyes always bright and direct. Since my wife's death, she had stopped by now and then, bringing bread, fresh flowers, or simply sitting with me over tea in silence. But today, she brought no bread. She was holding a gray metal box against her chest, just wide enough for both arms, looking heavy and solid. "Robert," she said softly, "may I come in?" I nodded and stepped aside to let her in. When the door closed behind her, I realized my hands were slightly trembling. Nora set the box on the living room table, right where the light from the window fell. It looked like the kind used for important documents, with a combination lock, its surface lightly scratched by time. She sat down across from me and let out a long breath. "I hesitated all day," she said, "but after what's been happening, I don't think I could wait any longer." I looked at the box, then at her. "What is that, Nora?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she rested her hand on the lid, as if touching something fragile. "Your wife gave this to me 6 months before she passed," she said slowly. "She asked me to keep it, and to bring it to you only when the time came." I swallowed. "When would that be?" Nora lifted her eyes and looked straight at me. "When Lydia started to show her true face." The name landed in the quiet room heavier than any sound. I felt a chill spread across my back. "She talked to you about Lydia?" "She did," Nora replied. "Not much, but enough for me to understand she was deeply worried." She pushed the box toward me. "Robert, I think this is that time." I reached out and touched the box. Cold, very cold. The metal under my fingers felt solid, grounding, so different from the uncertainty of the past few days. I turned the combination lock using the numbers Nora read out to me, a familiar sequence, our anniversary. The lid popped open with a soft click. Inside, everything was arranged so neatly it took my breath away. A thick folder with a brown, hard cover bearing the name of the family lawyer I recognized immediately. Beneath it was a sealed envelope, the outside written in handwriting I knew at once, my wife's, and at the bottom of the box, resting inside a clear plastic sleeve, was a small black USB drive. I stared at those items for a long time without touching them. Nora sat quietly, not rushing me. She understood moments like this couldn't be hurried. "What did she tell you?" I asked, my voice rough. Nora took a deep breath. "She said you might not believe it right away, because you always want to see the best in people, especially in your son and his wife." I lowered my head. That was me. Always choosing trust, always choosing endurance. "She said Lydia wasn't who she appeared to be," Nora continued, "that she was very patient, very good at waiting, and that you," she paused, "were the target." I closed my eyes. The image of my wife came back with painful clarity. In her final months, she had grown thin quickly, but her eyes had remained bright, sharp. I had thought she was worrying too much because of her illness. I had told her everything would be fine. I had been wrong. I opened the folder first. Inside were legal documents, clearly marked and carefully organized. I turned page after page, and the more I read, the slower my heart beat. Not from fear, but from understanding taking shape. A trust. Established more than a year earlier, I was listed as the primary beneficiary. My assets, the house, my savings, my investments had been legally placed into it, with strict conditions. No one could interfere. No one could transfer anything without meeting clear requirements and independent oversight. My wife had done this, quietly, without telling me a word. My throat tightened. She prepared all of this?" Nora nodded. "She was afraid that if she told you, you would stop her. Not because you didn't trust her, but because you didn't want confrontation. She understood you better than anyone." I let out a soft, breathless laugh. She was right. I hated confrontation. I had always believed silence kept the peace, but my wife had seen what I refused to see. I picked up the USB drive, small, light, but in my hand it felt as heavy as a final message. "What's on it?" I asked. She said there was a message for you, Nora said, and a few other things. She wanted you to watch it when you had the courage. I stood and walked toward my study. Nora didn't follow. She understood this was my moment alone. I plugged the USB into the computer. A single folder appeared on the screen. I clicked it. One video file showed up, simply named without a date. When I pressed play, my wife appeared on the screen. She was lying in a hospital bed. The light was soft, her face thin, but her eyes still bright, still fixed on the camera. My heart seemed to stop for a beat. "Robert," she said, her voice weak but clear. "If you're watching this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you these things myself." I raised a hand to cover my mouth. My breath shook. "I know you," she continued. "You'll blame yourself. You'll think you should have seen it sooner. But please, don't do that. You are not wrong for being kind." She paused, breathing with effort, then went on. "Lydia is not kind. I've been watching her for a long time. The way she asks about paperwork, the way she looks at this house, not like a home, but like an asset." I closed my eyes as each word cut deep. "She didn't tell you," she said, her voice softening, "because she was afraid you would choose silence one more time. She didn't want you to have to fight when she was no longer by your side, but she also couldn't let you be hurt." She smiled very faintly. "So I prepared, not for revenge, but to protect you." The screen shook slightly as she coughed. I wanted to reach out and touch the screen, but all I could do was look. "You are not alone, Robert," she said, her voice firmer now. "You never have been." The video ended in silence. I sat there for a long time, the dark screen reflecting my own aged face. For the first time since everything began, I no longer felt lost. I was no longer an old man being dragged into a scheme he didn't understand. I was someone who had been prepared, protected, loved, even when the person who loved me was no longer here. When I returned to the living room, Nora was still sitting there, her hands clasped together. She looked at me and didn't ask anything. She simply stood up, walked over, and placed her hand on my shoulder. "She loved you very much," Nora said softly. I nodded. "I know. And finally, I understand." In that moment, in the quiet house, I realized something with absolute clarity. No matter how many layers of traps Lydia had set, no matter how elaborate her plan was, I was no longer an easy target. My wife had stayed one step ahead, and she had left me not just assets, but truth, strength, and the reminder that I had never had to face any of this alone. The next morning, I woke up with a very strange feeling. Not fear, and not quite calm either. It was like standing in front of an old bridge you've inspected dozens of times, knowing it can bear the load, yet still feeling your body tense at the moment your foot first touches it. I was making coffee when the phone rang. This time it wasn't an unknown number. It was Collins. "You should sit down before you hear this," he said as soon as I answered. I didn't reply. I was already sitting. "Lydia just filed a petition with the county court," Collins continued. "An emergency guardianship request." I closed my eyes and let out a slow breath. Even though I had prepared myself, the words still landed like a hammer to the chest. "What is she alleging?" "Incapacity," he said. "Cognitive decline. Inability to manage finances and care for yourself." I let out a short laugh. Not loud, not bitter, just a dry sound, like realizing a steel structure has corroded exactly where you suspected from the start. "So she made that move." "There's more," Collins went on. "The file is thick. Photos of your house in a state of disarray, statements from neighbors claiming they've seen you wandering at night, talking to yourself. There's even a letter from a doctor stating you show signs of memory decline." I opened my eyes. The kitchen was as neat as ever. The coffee cup in front of me was steaming. Everything looked so normal it was almost absurd compared to what he was describing. "Which doctor?" I asked. "Robert Simmons," Collins replied. "Do you remember him?" I remembered very clearly. I had seen Dr. Simmons 3 months earlier for a routine checkup. He had even praised my memory as better than that of many younger patients. "That letter is fake," I said. "I can prove it." "I know," Collins said, "but Lydia is playing a very familiar game. She doesn't need the truth. She just needs to create enough doubt for the court to grant temporary authority." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. The sky was a pale gray, clouds drifting slowly. Lydia wasn't panicking. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She was doing exactly what my wife had warned: patient, calculated, and ruthless. "You need a lawyer," Collins said. "Today, someone who specializes in elder financial abuse." "I know," I replied, and this time I truly did. That afternoon, I met Rebecca Morales at her office downtown. An old building, slow elevators, narrow hallways. Not flashy, but there was something solid in the way everything was maintained. Rebecca was in her early 50s, dark brown hair pulled back neatly. Her eyes were sharp and focused, her movements economical. She listened as I told her everything, from the call at 1:48 a.m. to my wife's fireproof box. She didn't interrupt, only took steady notes, occasionally asking for a very small detail: the exact time, the words Lydia used, the names of witnesses. When I finished, she set her pen down. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "I can guess," I said. "An attack." "No," she shook her head. "This is a counterattack. She's counterattacking because her original plan failed." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "If you had transferred the money that night," Rebecca said, "we probably wouldn't be sitting here. She's been planning the next step for a long time. Guardianship. That was the destination. The money was just the road." She opened another folder. "But she moved too fast, and she left more traces than she realizes." Rebecca explained slowly and clearly. In cases like this, the petitioner often relies on emotion and bias. An older man living alone, recently bereaved, easily portrayed as someone who needs protection. But the law doesn't rely on feelings. It relies on independent evidence. "We're going to do 2 things immediately," she said. "First, an independent psychological evaluation." Not through her doctor, through a court-recognized specialist. "And the second, we're going to turn her own file against her." I didn't understand right away. Rebecca gave a small smile. "People who fabricate don't have patience. They overdo it." 2 days later, I walked into the office of Dr. Helen Carter, a clinical psychologist with more than 30 years of experience. Her office was bright and quiet, with the faint scent of wood and tea. It didn't feel like an interrogation. It felt like a long conversation. She asked about my daily life, what time I woke up, how I managed my finances, how well I remembered recent events. Then she moved on to tests, remembering number sequences, solving hypothetical situations, simple logic analysis. No trick questions, just careful observation. 90 minutes passed quickly. When we finished, Dr. Carter set her papers down, looked at me, and smiled. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you are more cognitively intact than many people I see at your age. Your memory, judgment, and decision-making are entirely normal." I felt an invisible weight lift from my chest, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew this document would speak for me in court. Rebecca received the evaluation that same afternoon. She read it carefully, then nodded. "Good," she said. "Now it's time to look at Lydia's file." We sat across from each other, page by page. Photos of a cluttered kitchen, not mine. Wrong angles, odd composition. One small but critical detail. The wall calendar in the photos was a model discontinued 2 years earlier. Rebecca circled it in red. Statements from neighbors, addresses that didn't match anyone living near me, sloppy signatures, no verifiable contact information, and the letter from Dr. Simmons. Rebecca called the clinic directly. 10 minutes later, she hung up and looked at me. He didn't write that letter. The signature was copied. I sat still, feeling something very strange. Not anger, not pain, but the cold clarity of someone watching an entire fraudulent structure reveal itself, beam by beam. "She's starting to slip," Rebecca said, "because she thought you'd panic, that you'd stay quiet, that you'd comply." "But I'm not who I was," I said. Rebecca looked at me, her expression serious but faintly satisfied. "Exactly. And that's the most dangerous thing for people like Lydia." The preliminary hearing was scheduled faster than I expected. When I walked into the courtroom, Lydia was already there, sitting upright, her hand resting on Evan's. She wore neutral colors, her face carefully arranged into the kind of expression courts often find believable. Just enough worry, just enough sadness. She didn't look at me. Evan did. His eyes flicked toward me briefly, then dropped. When Lydia's lawyer presented their case, everything unfolded exactly as Rebecca had predicted. A carefully woven story about an elderly father, lonely, vulnerable. Lydia spoke in a trembling voice, invoking safety and best interests. When it was Rebecca's turn, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply placed each piece of truth on the table. The independent psychological evaluation, the confirmation call from Dr. Simmons's office, the inconsistencies in the photos, the discrepancies in the statements. The room grew quiet. I didn't look at Lydia, but I felt the shift. The air around her was no longer as solid as it had been, a hand tightening slightly, a frown she couldn't hide in time, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. Lydia no longer had full control of the story. When the hearing adjourned, the judge requested further review of the evidence and issued no immediate ruling. No win, no loss. But I knew, and Lydia knew, the balance had begun to tilt. As we stepped out of the courtroom, I paused and took a deep breath. Rebecca placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did very well," she said. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the stone steps outside the courthouse, where the late afternoon sun cast sharp patches of light and shadow. In that moment, I understood something important. Lydia had chosen the right target, but the wrong timing. She thought I was still the man who would stay silent to keep the family together. That man was gone. And her first cracks, small as they were, had already begun to show. Evan came that evening after night had fully fallen. I didn't hear his car from a distance like I used to. Only when there was a very soft knock, almost hesitant, did I realize someone was standing on the porch. I opened the door and saw my son standing there. Not the Evan I used to know. Not the well-dressed man in his 30s who spoke carefully in front of his wife. The man in front of me looked visibly thinner. His coat was wrinkled, as if he'd been wearing it for days. His eyes were red, hollowed, constantly darting behind him as if afraid someone might be watching. "Dad," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. Just one word, but enough to tighten my chest. I stepped aside without speaking and let him into the house. Evan crossed the threshold like someone fleeing from a very distant, very dark place. When the door closed, he stood still for a few seconds, his hands clenched together. Then, suddenly, Evan collapsed into the armchair, bending forward, elbows on his knees. I saw his shoulders shake, no sound, no sobbing, just the uneven breathing of someone who had tried for too long not to fall apart. "I can't take it anymore," he said very softly. "Dad, I can't take it anymore." I didn't sit down right away. I stood facing him, looking at my son as if at a stranger I had missed for many years. In that moment, I knew that if I asked the wrong question or said the wrong thing, Evan might shut down again. This time, forever. "It's okay," I said slowly. "You're home now." Those two words, "home now," seemed to break something inside him. Evan raised his hands to cover his face. This time, I heard real crying. Rough, painful, stripped of any attempt to save face. It took a long time before he could lift his head. His eyes were red and swollen, looking at me with a mix of fear and pleading. "You think I'm a traitor, don't you?" he asked. I know you've thought that." I took a deep breath. "I thought you were silent," I said, "and I didn't understand why." Evan nodded. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" I asked, even though I already sensed the answer. "Afraid of losing everything," Evan said. "She has documents, my signatures, things I don't even remember signing. She said if I turned on her, she'd put it all on me. Say I was the mastermind. I'd lose my job, my freedom. I'd lose you." He swallowed. I believed her. I sat down across from Evan. The distance between father and son was now just a small table, but it felt as though we had crossed a very deep chasm. "You'll understand once you listen," Evan said, sliding the USB toward me. "I kept it until now because I was waiting. I waited until you no longer believed her." I picked up the USB. This time, it didn't feel light. It felt as heavy as 3 years of silence, 3 years of fear, 3 years of endurance carried by my son. I plugged the USB into the computer. A long list of files appeared, each one labeled with a date and time. Hundreds of files. I opened one. Lydia's voice came through, chillingly clear. Gone was the gentle tone she used in front of me. Gone was the victim's voice. What remained was bare calculation. "He won't suspect anything," Lydia said in the first recording. "That old man always thinks people are better than they really are." I heard Evan's breathing quicken behind me. I opened another file. "Guardianship is the final step," Lydia said. "The money is just a way to prove he can't manage his finances. Once the court grants authority, everything automatically comes into my hands." Another file. "Evan just needs to cooperate. If he resists, I know how to keep him quiet." I stopped, not because I couldn't bear it, but because I needed to breathe. "Her name isn't Lydia," Evan said behind me, his voice so soft it nearly vanished. "I heard it in one of the calls. She used another name before she met me." I turned around. "What name?" "Lillian Drake," Evan replied. "At least in another state. She was married before. Her ex-husband lost everything. And then she disappeared." I closed my eyes. The pieces snapped into place with terrifying precision. The stranger in the night, the folder with my name on it. Derek Hayes, guardianship. The trust my wife had set up. "You're a victim too," I said slowly. Evan broke down again, this time making no attempt to hide it. "I know," he said, "but I let her hurt you. I don't deserve forgiveness." I stood and walked over to my son. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about court or Lydia or the law. I only saw the child I once held by the hand to cross the street, taught to tie his shoes, protected when he was afraid of the dark. I placed my hand on Evan's shoulder. "You deserve to live," I said. "And you did the right thing, even if it was late." Evan looked up at me, stunned. "Dad, you're not angry?" "Of course I'm angry," I said honestly. "But I'm not blind. You were controlled, and you chose the truth when you could." I looked at the USB on the table. From now on, we're not on opposite sides. Evan nodded slowly, as if afraid that moving too fast might make everything disappear. "I'll do whatever you need," he said. I'll testify. I'll tell everything." I looked at my son for a long time. Inside me, something that had been fractured for years began to close. Not fully healed, but enough for us to stand together. "We'll do this together," I said, not for revenge, but to end it. Outside, the night wind moved softly through the trees. In this house that had once felt so lonely, for the first time in many years, I no longer felt alone. My son and I, finally, were standing on the same side. The meeting took place at a small cafe near the old train station, where the fluorescent lights were always brighter than necessary, and the smell of burnt coffee hung in the air. I arrived 10 minutes early, sat at a table by the window, and watched traffic crawl along the wet road after the night's rain. Evan didn't come with me this time. He stayed home, preparing what Rebecca had asked for. I was here to meet someone whose life Lydia had entered in the cruelest way possible. The man arrived right on time. He was in his early 60s, tall and thin, shoulders slightly sloped, gray hair cut short. His gaze didn't avoid mine, but there was a layer of exhaustion so deep I recognized it immediately. The exhaustion of someone who has told the same story over and over for years, with few willing to listen. "You're Robert?" he asked, his voice low. "I am," I replied, standing to shake his hand. His hand was dry and cold. "Henry Lawson," he introduced himself as he sat down across from me. "Rebecca contacted me. She said, 'My story might help you.'" I nodded. "I'm very grateful you agreed to meet." Henry took a sip of coffee, grimaced at the bitterness, but didn't add sugar. "I've told this story many times," he said. "Not for sympathy, just so someone else doesn't end up where I did." He looked straight at me. "You want to know about Lydia, but that's not the name I knew her by." I leaned back. "Then what name did you know her as?" Henry gave a faint smile. Lillian Drake." The name Evan had mentioned, hearing it from someone else, sent a chill down my spine. There was no doubt anymore. "We met 12 years ago," Henry began. "In another state, she entered my life very naturally, not rushed, not flashy. She said she worked for a charity, or at least that's what she told me. She was a good listener." He gave a soft laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "So good that I thought I'd finally met someone who truly cared." Henry spoke slowly, without embellishment. The way Lillian entered his life was identical to how Lydia had entered mine. Patient, attentive, always positioning herself as the supportive, understanding one. She didn't ask about money at first. She didn't mention paperwork. She talked about family, about people who had betrayed her in the past, about her fear of abandonment. "She was always the victim in her own story," Henry said, "and I believed her." I didn't interrupt. I had heard that voice before, the voice of a man who once believed love and patience were enough to sustain a healthy relationship. "About a year later," Henry continued, "she started helping me organize my finances. Said that at my age I needed to simplify things. It sounded reasonable. I let her look at my documents, just look." He looked up at me. "You know how it goes. Just looking is enough." I did know. I remembered the look in Lydia's eyes when she examined my files, unhurried but intensely focused. "Then came the credit lines," Henry said. "Then the temporary transfers. Then the guardianship suggestion, because I was forgetful. She said it was just a formality to protect me." Henry fell silent for a moment, letting the memories settle. By the time I realized what was happening, I no longer had access to my accounts. The house was under a trust, the car was sold, and she disappeared. "The police?" I asked. Henry shook his head. "She was very careful. Everything had signatures, paperwork. When I reported it, they said it was a civil dispute, not enough for criminal charges." He gave a dry laugh. "Until they realized I wasn't the only one." Henry pulled a thin stack of papers from his jacket and placed it on the table, sliding it toward me. This is a list of people I know. People she targeted. At least 6, possibly more. Same script, different names, different states. I flipped through the pages. Names, dates, amounts, all painfully familiar. There's one more detail, Henry said quietly. Something you should probably know. I looked up. Her biological father, Henry said. He was a victim too. I froze. Her father? Yes, Henry replied. I met him once, very briefly, after everything fell apart for me. He lived in a small apartment, almost nothing to his name. He said Lillian had been listed on his accounts, supposedly to help manage his retirement money. Then, one day, he no longer had access. Henry exhaled heavily. Even the man who brought her into this world wasn't spared. I set the papers down. What I felt now wasn't anger, and it wasn't hatred. It was a cold clarity. Lydia, or Lillian, didn't act on impulse, and not out of momentary greed. She operated on a model. A fraud model, I said slowly. Henry nodded. Exactly. Choose older targets with assets and family ties that can be manipulated. Build trust. Gather documents. Isolate the victim. Then take control. I thought of Evan, of his silence all those years. Not because he was complicit, but because he'd been placed exactly where Lydia needed him to be. The bridge and the hostage. Rebecca was right, I said. This isn't just a family matter. Henry looked at me seriously. You have evidence, he said. Your son's USB, your wife's trust, witnesses, and now my testimony. He paused. That changes everything. Oh, I understood immediately. What Lydia had done was no longer confined to a personal dispute. Multiple victims, multiple states, the same method. This was no longer a local issue. This is a federal crime, I said. Henry nodded. Finally, someone says it out loud. I sat quietly for a moment, looking out the window. A train rolled past slowly, metal clanging rhythmically. I thought of my wife, of how she had prepared the trust in silence. I thought of Evan, who had held on to those recordings for 3 years in fear. And I thought of Henry, sitting across from me, a man who had lost nearly everything because he trusted the wrong person. Are you willing to testify? I asked. Henry didn't answer right away. He looked at his now cold coffee, then raised his eyes. I've waited 12 years for that question, he said. I have nothing left to lose. We stood up at the same time. When we shook hands again, his hand was no longer as cold as it had been before. On the drive home, I drove more slowly than usual. Everything had become very clear. Lydia wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law. She was a predator, with a long and sophisticated history. And my family, Evan and I, were just one link in a long chain of victims. But because of that, I knew this. The truth was no longer standing alone. It had witnesses, evidence, a clear pattern. And for the first time since all of this began, I no longer felt like I was trapped in a defensive position. I was standing where the entire picture was visible. And Lydia, no matter how many times she changed her name, had finally reached the point where no script could hide her anymore. I spent nearly 2 days preparing for that meeting, not to organize documents, but to organize myself. Some things, if done in anger, leave openings. I wouldn't allow that. I needed a different face, the face Lydia knew, trusted, and always believed she could control. I called her late in the afternoon, keeping my voice just tired enough, just slow enough. I said I didn't want to drag this out anymore, that I was old, that I didn't have the strength for more stress, that I was thinking about family, about Evan. I said I was willing to reconcile if there was a clear agreement so everything could end peacefully. On the other end of the line, Lydia was silent for a long time. I could picture the small smile at the corner of her mouth, the smile of someone who thinks the other side has yielded. She agreed to come to my house the next morning, saying she would bring her lawyer so everything would be transparent. I hung up, set the phone down, and let out a long breath. This wasn't surrender. This was the final trap. That evening, Evan came over. We didn't say much. We understood each other through glances. I gave him the checklist. The cameras had already been installed the day before. Small ones, hidden in the bookshelf and the corners of the living room ceiling. The microphones were wired directly to the recorder. No internet, no risk of interruption. Rebecca had checked everything thoroughly, as she always did. Henry and Margaret had confirmed their arrival times. Officer Collins knew exactly when to come. Not early, not late. We worked quietly, like people setting a table for a chess game where the final move had already been calculated. The next morning, the sun was gentle. Light streamed through the living room windows, falling across the wooden table where I had placed the stack of papers, the agreement Lydia expected. I brewed tea slowly, keeping my breathing steady. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. Perhaps when someone has gone far enough into fear, what remains is clarity. The doorbell rang right on time. Lydia entered with her lawyer, a man much younger than me, neatly dressed, eyes alert. Lydia smiled, that familiar, soft smile, as if everything that had happened was just a misunderstanding. She glanced around the room, her eyes passing over the family photos, then settling on me. "Thank you for agreeing to talk," she said sweetly. "I know you've been very tired." I nodded and invited them to sit. "I want this to end peacefully," I said. "For Evan." Lydia flicked a quick glance at her lawyer, then looked back at me. "That's what I want too." The lawyer opened his briefcase and laid out several documents neatly on the table. I looked at them, but didn't touch them. I let Lydia speak. She talked about concern, about responsibility, about guardianship being nothing more than a protective measure. Her words flowed smoothly, as if rehearsed many times. I nodded, sighed occasionally, playing the role of a man too weary to do anything but give in. When she finished, I said, "Before I sign, I want to be sure of one thing." Lydia tilted her head. "What is it?" "I want to hear again," I said evenly, "what you said about me when you thought I wasn't listening." The air in the room changed instantly. Lydia's lawyer frowned. Lydia smiled lightly. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I didn't answer. I reached over and pressed a small button on the remote beside the chair. Lydia's voice filled the room, clear, cold, stripped of all sweetness. Guardianship is the final step. Once the court grants authority, everything automatically transfers into my hands. The smile on Lydia's lips froze. Her lawyer snapped his head toward her. I didn't stop. I let the next recording play. Her voice, sharper and more ruthless. "That old man won't suspect a thing. He always thinks people are better than they really are." Lydia jumped to her feet. "Turn it off!" she shouted. It was the first time I'd heard real panic in her voice. "Sit down," her lawyer said tightly. "What is this?" I looked straight at Lydia. "It's the truth," I said. "The thing you thought would never see the light." The living room door opened. Evan walked in, followed by Henry and Margaret. They didn't speak. They just stood there. Their presence made Lydia step back, as if she'd just seen old ghosts. Henry spoke, his voice low. "Lillian Drake, or Lydia Hale. Either name will do. Do you remember me?" Lydia's face drained of color. She turned to her lawyer, her mouth opening, but no words came out. Margaret placed a stack of photos on the table, pictures of Lydia at night, handing over a folder with my name on it. Evan set down the other USB drive, gently but decisively. Lydia's lawyer flipped through a few pages quickly, then stopped, his expression changing completely. "You didn't tell me about this," he said coldly. "About the recordings, about the witnesses." "You have to help me," Lydia said, her voice shaking. "They're setting me up." "No," he replied. "They're presenting evidence." At that moment, I heard a car stop outside. No rushing, no noise, doors opening, steady footsteps on the walkway. Officer Collins and 2 other officers entered. Collins looked at me and gave a very slight nod, a signal we'd agreed on. "Lydia Hale," he said clearly. "Or Lillian Drake. You are under arrest on suspicion of federal financial fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to seize assets." Lydia turned, scanning the room as if searching for an exit. There was none. She looked at me, her eyes no longer hiding anything, only raw resentment. "You think you've won?" she snarled. I stood up, feeling strangely light. "No," I said. "I just think things have finally fallen into their proper place." Then the handcuffs closed with a dry, metallic click. Lydia was led outside. Her lawyer stood frozen, his briefcase slipping from his hand. Evan let out a long breath, as if, for the first time in years, his lungs had finally filled with air. When the door closed behind the officers, the room became strangely quiet. The sunlight was the same. The wooden table was still there, but everything had changed. I looked around, at Evan, Henry, Margaret. People who had been pulled into Lydia's scheme in different ways were now standing here, on the same side. I didn't feel triumph. I only felt a necessary ending. The trap had closed, not with revenge, but with truth. And for the first time in a very long while, I knew that tonight, when I turned off the lights and sat down in the armchair by the window, the darkness would no longer carry whispered lies. The trial began on a lightly gray morning, the kind of weather where it's hard to tell whether it will rain or clear up. I arrived early, not because I was anxious, but because I didn't want to walk into the courtroom feeling pushed along. I wanted to open that door myself. The courtroom wasn't as large as I had imagined. High ceiling, even white lighting, the smell of old wood and paper. Everything was orderly, strict, leaving no room for excess emotion. I sat in the front row, back straight, hands resting on my thighs. Evan sat 1 row behind me. I didn't turn around, but I knew he was there. When Lydia was brought in, I didn't recognize her at first, not because I'd forgotten her face, but because she looked different. No subtle makeup, no confident stride. The light-colored prison uniform made her face look paler, her eyes darting around as if she were still searching for a way to control the room. She didn't look at me. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The trial began with familiar procedures, but I didn't pay much attention. I focused on my breathing, steady, slow. I hadn't waited for this moment to win, but to tell the truth fully. When the prosecutor called my name, I stood and walked to the witness stand. The wood under my hand felt cool. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. In that moment, I thought of my wife. I thought of how she always said that truth, when spoken at the right time, can save a life. I started from the beginning. No more, no less. The call at 1:48 a.m., my son's trembling voice, the whispered instructions in the background, the transfer orders, the bank, the forged documents, the guardianship petition. I spoke slowly and clearly, almost as if I were explaining a technical sequence. An old engineer's habit, perhaps. The defense attorney tried to interrupt a few times, but the judge signaled for me to continue. I didn't look at Lydia as I spoke. I stared straight ahead. I didn't need to see her to remember every detail. When I mentioned the fireproof box and my wife's video, the room went silent. No one cried. No one whispered. Just the dense silence of people listening to a story they could no longer dismiss as private. When my testimony ended, I stepped down and returned to my seat. My legs felt slightly tired, but my mind felt lighter than I'd expected. Then it was Evan's turn. I heard the chair slide back behind me. As my son stepped onto the witness stand, I felt a distinct shift in the air. Not because he was a new witness, but because he was someone who had once stood on the other side. Evan spoke in a low, steady voice. Not loud, not shaking. He talked about years of pressure, whispered threats, being forced to sign documents he hadn't been allowed to read properly, about keeping recordings not for revenge but for self-protection. When he said he was more afraid of losing his father than losing anything else, I lowered my head. The defense attorney tried to suggest that Evan was an accomplice. Evan didn't react angrily. He simply said, "I stayed silent because I was controlled, but I'm not silent anymore." That sentence stayed with me for a long time. After Evan, others took the stand. Henry Lawson, an elderly woman from another state, her voice trembling but her eyes firm. A man who had lost his house after signing a power of attorney he hadn't fully understood. Different stories, same structure, same ending. I realized Lydia didn't just repeat her script. She refined it with each victim. The prosecutor presented the evidence, recordings, statements, forged signatures, the video of Lydia describing guardianship as the final step. Each piece appeared on the screen like a brick. None was enough to convict on its own, but together they formed an unbreakable wall. I glanced at Lydia. For the first time, she couldn't maintain her composure. Her hands clenched, her jaw tightened. She whispered something to her lawyer, but he only shook his head. During the final arguments, the defense spoke about Lydia's difficult childhood, about mistakes made under pressure, about the possibility of rehabilitation. I didn't deny those things in my heart, but I also understood that compassion cannot erase consequences. When the judge stood to deliver the verdict, the entire courtroom rose. I felt Evan standing very close behind me. Lydia was convicted on multiple charges: federal financial fraud, document forgery, conspiracy to seize assets. The sentence was heavier than I had expected. When the number of years was read, I didn't feel relief. I felt a door closing. Lydia stood still. No tears, no shouting, just staring straight ahead, as if trying to memorize the moment so she could one day retell it in her own way. But this time, the story no longer belonged to her. When the trial ended, people began to leave. I stayed seated for a few seconds. Evan placed his hand on my shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. I nodded. "Yeah." Outside, the daylight made me squint. The sky was clearer, not sunny, but bright enough to see each step clearly. I took a deep breath. No whispers, no late-night calls, no documents waiting to be signed. The scheme was over. Not because I was smarter than anyone else, but because the truth, at last, had been spoken by enough people, at the right time. And as I walked down those steps, I knew that what lay ahead was no longer about fighting, but about learning how to live again. Not in fear, but with clarity. That night I slept for a long time. No dreams, no jolting awake, no phone ringing in the middle of the night, no whispers behind closed doors, no feeling that I had to keep listening for someone quietly taking something from me. When I opened my eyes, morning light had filled the room, soft and even, as if the house itself had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. I sat up slowly, listening to a silence that felt both familiar and new. Birds in the yard, the wind gently moving the branches, the sound of water starting to boil when I turned on the stove. Small, ordinary sounds that had disappeared from my life for a long time without me realizing it. Nothing had changed much on the surface. The house was the same. The old furniture, the armchair by the window, my wife's photo on the wooden shelf where the morning light always reached first. But inside, everything felt different. No sense of intrusion, no vague fear that even the smallest decision could be exploited. I made coffee and took the mug out to the back porch. I sat down and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about what I needed to guard against. I was just thinking about what I would do today. A small thing, but to me, it was a victory. Evan visits me more often now, not out of guilt, but because he wants to. He no longer speaks to me cautiously or avoids my eyes. We don't talk much about the past. There's no need to reopen what's already hurt enough. We talk about ordinary things. His new job, a plan to move, a weekend outing. I see him lighter now. The constant tension in his eyes is gone, the look of someone always waiting to be called out in the night. One morning, Evan stood in the kitchen helping me fix an old hinge. As he worked, he said, "I didn't think I could ever live normally again." I didn't answer right away. I just handed him the screwdriver he needed. He understood. Some answers don't need words. We're learning how to be father and son again. Slowly, imperfectly, but honestly. People have asked me if I feel triumphant, if I feel relieved. I've thought about that question for a long time. I don't feel triumphant, and I don't feel joy in winning or losing. I feel a deep, quiet steadiness, like after a storm passes, not cheers, but the silence that remains, the silence that allows people to rebuild roofs, replant trees, and believe that tomorrow can still begin. I didn't become a different person. I'm still me, an older man who tends to believe in the good, who's used to enduring, who puts family first. But I've learned how to set boundaries, not to push people away, but to protect myself. I understand now that kindness doesn't mean accepting exploitation, and silence doesn't always preserve harmony. Sometimes it only prolongs harm. The story you've just heard is a fictional story inspired by real-life situations and human experiences, created to offer moral value, life lessons, and emotional connection for the audience. It does not represent any specific individual or organization, and it does not encourage imitation of the actions in the video, nor does it incite or target any person or group. I'm telling this story not to promote confrontation, but as a reminder. I believe that sometimes the greatest value of a story lies in very simple truths. That clarity doesn't come from doubting everyone, but from listening to your own intuition. That family isn't unconditional endurance, but a relationship that must be nurtured with mutual respect. That age doesn't weaken us if we're still willing to learn and change, and that speaking the truth, even late, is always better than carrying it alone in silence. If this story made you pause for even a moment to reflect on your own life, then it has already had enough value for me. If you're listening to this story from somewhere in the world, I'd truly like to know where you are. If you've been through a difficult period, or if you simply want to share a personal thought, feel free to leave a few lines in the comments. And if stories like this give you something, whether it's connection, calm, or simply the feeling that you're not alone, please consider liking, subscribing, and staying with me for the stories ahead. Thank you for taking the time to listen. At this age, I understand that time is the most valuable thing we have. And the fact that you chose to stay and listen all the way to these final words is a gift I sincerely appreciate.